My name's Robbie, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm an addict, but I'm an alcoholic who doesn't drink alcohol today, and I'm a drug addict who doesn't take drugs today. I don't need these things to change the way that I feel today because I have recovered. I've recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body as a direct result of getting connected to a higher power and working these 12 steps of recovery. I use the word recovered, guys, because, well, it's the first promise on the first page of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It says, we of AA, CA are people who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. I use the word recovered because, well, I've returned to a normal state of health. I've been restored to usefulness. But in recovery terms, the word recovered just means that I now have an effective mental defense against the first one. I had absolutely no defense, guys, from the get-go. For 25 years of drinking and drugging, I had absolutely no defense whatsoever. And let me tell you, that defense doesn't come from me. That's through the grace of God. Through good sponsorship from somebody armed with the facts about this stuff, who took the time to show me this stuff, and following clear-cut directions precisely as they're written in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. First things first, guys, I want to say a big thank you, Dave. Thank you to Ryan for the nice welcome, and also Martin. Welcome back, brother. It's great to see you. And anyone else who's back from a relapse or a newcomer or just struggling, welcome. We have a wonderful, wonderful life on offer in these rooms if you can just do what others have done before you. I'd just like to start off by saying that I no longer live my life miserable, sober, and clean one day at a time. I live my life happily one day at a time. And something else I don't do is wake up with the intention of just not drinking or drugging today. I wake up with the intention of never, ever drinking or drugging again. And as long as, again, I stay close to my higher power and continue to practice the principles, outlined in the big book, I know I'll be okay, safe and protected. Guys, I've got faith today. And I'm no longer driven by fear. It's an absolute miracle. I believe in those today because I am a fucking miracle. Pardon my French. And I look around the rooms of Cocaine Anonymous and I see miracles everywhere. This stuff works. I absolutely love this proactive fellowship where we don't just sit around and talk about what it's like being unwell. We talk about how to get fucking well. That was my problem. Wandering around in a hopeless state of mind and body, listening to people saying, just don't pick up the first drink and drug and you won't get high. Stay away from that big book. You won't find the solution in there, and it didn't work. What happened to me is I came in, I heard that message, and I drank and used again. And it took me 2.5 years, of digging that hole even deeper before I finally was done. So done. Stevie Wonder could tell that I was done. And I came in, I shut up and I listened. I did exactly what I was told to do by a man, like I say, armed with the facts. And I am so grateful to that man for what he has done. He's taken my hand and he's put it in the hands of my higher power. And today, life is absolutely amazing. I hear people saying in the rooms of Cocaine Anonymous, I'm so grateful I got my old life back. I wouldn't have thanked you for that old life that I had. It was fucking shit. What I've been given as a result of coming in here is a brand new life, a second chance. I have been reborn. The book asks us to talk in a general way, what we were like, what happened, and what it's like now. And I'm going to try and do that quickly, guys. I'll run through my life. And let me tell you, I was irritable, restless, and discontented before I even picked up a drink or a drug. There was something not quite right with me. I always felt on the outside looking in. I could be at my own birthday party, still feel like the odd one out. I was constantly trying to people please, get you to like me. I'll be a Rangers supporter for you and a Celtic supporter for this crowd. I would spend money that I never had, buying things that I didn't need, just to impress people that I didn't even fucking like. I would do anything for your attention and your affection. There was something not quite right with me. And let me tell you, when I had my first spiritual experience at the age of about 13 years old, yeah, my first drink, it did things for me that I could never ever do for myself. It did so much for me that I really didn't give a shit what it was doing to me. And right from the get-go. I've never been able to control it, guys. I'm one of those ones, you know, from the very start. You know, I was always the one getting carted home from parties. You know, my dad getting phoned up and said, right, you know, come and pick up your son. He's absolutely wasted in the cubicles or the toilets or the house parties. You know, I was never ever to control it. And what I've learned today is coming into the rooms of CA and is that, you know, I suffer from an abnormal reaction to alcohol and drugs. You know, one is too many, 1,000's not enough, as they say in another fellowship. When I drink, I get thirstier. When I put drugs inside me, I just have this insatiable, this need for more and more. You know, and I hear the word rock bottom used a lot in the rooms. I really do. But to be honest, for me, that word means fuck all. You know, because every rock bottom that I had had a trap door and another rock bottom and another trap door. You know, I know today that I was playing Russian roulette with my life every time that I pick up a drink or a drug, because I don't know whether I'm going to wake up in a sick bed, a pissy bed, a hospital bed, a jail cell, some random woman's bed. It really is just Russian roulette. I have no idea. When I start, I cannot stop because I suffer from this allergic reaction, this phenomenon of craving that I get that normal people don't get. You know, my mum, my mates, they can go out and they can have just one or two pints and then go home and see the missus and watch the football. You know, they'll come and watch the football and go home to their missus for dinner. That's not my experience. You know, when I put it inside me, there's no control. And let me tell you, if I'm trying to control it, I'm like on a seesaw. If I'm trying to control it, I can't enjoy it. And if I'm enjoying it, there's certainly no control, and who knows where I'm going to end up. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, who knows? You know, I find myself waking up in random countries thinking to myself, how the fuck did that happen? You know, it's the allergy that I suffer from, and I believe I was born with this, you know, and I've never been able to control it. What I suffer from is a cunning, baffling, and powerful illness, you know, but it's also progressive, patient, and fucking fatal. You know, I've seen many people. In fact, the guy just up the road from me hung himself 2 days ago because he suffered from this illness, you know, and he never got the solution, which I am fortunate to have today. And it takes people out, guys. It's a progressive and terminal fatal illness. You know, I may be recovered, but I'll never be cured. What I've got is a daily reprieve contingent on doing some stuff every day, you know, inviting that higher power of mine into my life every moment of the day, not just in the morning, not just at night, but I need to be with him all through the day. Yeah, so this illness, this allergy that I have, you know, that takes me out, and you know, most people's allergies bring them out in spots and rashes, yeah. Mine brings me out in fucking handcuffs in hospitals. In fact, you know, to any normal person that this stuff happened to, they would just stop. But you know, unfortunately for me, you know, I'm an addict. You know, and I suffer from the main problem, you know, the top 3 inches, which is up here in my head, where I suffer from alcoholism and incredibly short memory, you know, where I forget just how bad it got a week or a month ago, as it says on page 24. My head has a liar, and it's a liar, and it's got a contract out of my arse, and it wants me to drink and use and die a horrible slow death. It forgets all the good it forgets all the bad times and just remembers the good times. It's like a highlights reel of match of the day. You know, it remembers all the good moments and forgets about all the bad. You know, it tells me, Robbie, the only reason you pissed yourself last night was because you didn't eat your dinner before you went out last night. You know, you've had your Weetabix, you're going to be all right. You know, it tells me the only reason I headbutted that copper in the pub was because I went to the wrong pub. If I go to a different pub, it'll be all right. You know, it's just a liar, an absolute liar. It convinces me, you know, that somehow, someday, some way, it's going to be different, and I'm going to manage to control it. You know, this illness that I suffer from, you know, took me to some really, really dark places. You know, I became so paranoid, I used to think the person in front of me was following me. Towards the end of my drinking and using, you know, I used to get found in cupboards, you know, surrounded by bottles of piss, too shit scared to come out, you know, convinced that something or someone was going to come and get me, sneaking around the house in my underpants, you know, trying to not make a noise because my daughter and my wife or my girlfriend are upstairs, my daughter's mother, you know, and pissing in the sink behind me because I don't want to wake them up. You know, all that kind of nonsense. looking at my daughter saying, why can't I stop for you? I should really go to my bed right now. But then I've got half a bag downstairs. I'll just have another line. I was totally chained to the mirror with a razor blade, as Liam Gallagher likes to say in one of his songs. It's a fact. I could never ever get away from it. And I talked about this maladjustment that I have to life that I've had since I was a very young child. Um, Unable to handle any sort of social environment is basically what I am. And alcohol and drugs changed the way that I felt. And when I discovered them, I began to use them all the time. I would drink and use before school, after school, even during school. I remember going to my social ed teacher and telling her that I thought I had a problem, but she just laughed it off and said, "Don't be silly." 14 years old, and she just laughed it off. Nothing was done. Anyway, I played football. I wasn't very good at school. Needless to say, I was not very good at school, but I liked playing football, and I wasn't very good at it, so they put me in goals. So, I tried really hard and I ended up becoming quite good at it. Probably, I feel, because I didn't want to get shouted at by the defenders for being rubbish and letting all the goals in. And I actually got trials with teams like Aberdeen, Glasgow, Rangers, and I flew down to London from Inverness a couple of times to have trials with Chelsea. And I believe I had a promising career ahead of me, but for my problem with alcohol and drugs, yeah. And my first job was with a team called Ross County up here in the Highlands. Cleaning boots and training with the first team, £60 a week. But it wasn't long before I was missing training, and then I was missing matches, and they dropped me. Rightly so. Bye bye career as a professional footballer. Then I went off to university. Somehow managed to get enough grades to get to uni down in Glasgow, bright lights of Glasgow. And I always share. I don't know if you guys have seen the film Human Traffic. The last great film of the 90s. And there's a line in it that says, "Bang, the weekend has landed. All that exists now are drugs, clubs, pubs, and parties. I've got 48 hours off from the world, man." But for me, that 48 hours very quickly turned into 96 hours. And before I knew it, I was drinking and using every day of the week. I was searching out all these sordid pubs and clubs and places where I could get my hands on things, and just drinking with the old men from first thing in the morning till last thing at night, and then buying a bag and continuing the party for one at home. Yeah. And I'm looking around and all my mates are getting their degrees and they're getting their nice cars and their wives and their burns, their babies, and nice houses, and I'm stuck in this fucking rut, unable to get out of it. Needless to say, I didn't even get the front doors of my university. Freshers Week was enough for me, and I found it. I was away, came home with my tail between my legs. Quite a recurring theme in my life, going back to mum and dad, and asking them for some help. Can I stay with you guys? I'm in trouble here. And that's when I started going to doctors, who would give me some drugs, say you're a wee bit anxious or depressed. Duh, I can't stop drinking and using, and I'm pissing all over the present. No wonder I'm depressed. I'm burning my life to the ground. This is my experience. It doesn't have to be yours, guys, okay? They weren't much help. My experience as an addict is they would give me things, to taper off a little bit or to help me out. But I would take the prescription to Boots the chemist, cash it in, swallow the lot, drink it with some vodka, and before I know it, I'm looking on the black market for more of that stuff, and I've lost 6 months, a year of my life on God knows what medication. They weren't much help. And drug and alcohol counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists, who actually locked me up in mental hospitals for a couple of weeks at a time. I've been there a few times. Then came the treatment centres. My parents spent an absolute fortune trying to get me well, but nothing could get me well because I'm an addict. They talk about triggers, and they used to talk about them in the group disgusting meetings that I went to, and one person's trigger is payday, another's falling out with the girlfriend. My trigger was just literally opening my fucking eyes in the morning, and I wanted to use. Nothing stopped me from drinking and drugging. I went from job to job to job, always getting fired for being too hired or wired, for being too wired, or I went from girlfriend to girlfriend. They'd always give me that ultimatum. It's the drink and the drugs or me. And I would say for a while, yes, of course, darling, I love you. And I genuinely did. But it wasn't long before I was picking up again. And lo and behold, the girlfriend leaves me. Doctors told me I was scarred inside, and if I carried on drinking the way that I was drinking, I was going to die. Did that stop me? No. I moved house, I moved town, I moved city, I moved country to try and get away from my illness. Did that work? No. In hindsight, moving to Ireland probably wasn't a great idea. Okay. Given that over there, every pub has got a bookies next door and a dealer outside. But I genuinely went over there convinced that I was going to make a go of things and it was going to be different this time. But it didn't work. I tried everything, countless vain attempts to control it, to moderate it, to stop it altogether, but nothing worked. Cocaine Anonymous is the only thing that has ever worked for me. I came in off the back of a big binge, broken and busted, certainly not to be trusted. And I was done. I'd had that internal snap. That sick and tired of being skint and wired. I just could not do this anymore. I got to that jumping off place where I couldn't live with drink and drugs. They were killing me. But I couldn't live happily without drink and drugs. I was irritable, restless, and discontented to the core. And I could not handle life on life's terms unless I had my solution, which was the drink and the drugs, which stopped working years ago. I was ready. I shut up and I listened and I found a sponsor. A guy made an approach to me, a crazy Irishman, who showed me what I needed to do. We went through the doctor's opinion, we went through Bill's story. I learned about the threefold illness, the allergy, the obsession, the malady, and that was a light bulb moment for me to finally get my diagnosis. The diagnosis that I've been searching for my whole life. I suffer from alcoholism, not bipolar, split personality, depression, anxiety, drug-induced psychosis, and all these other weird and wonderful things that the doctors told me were wrong with me. It was alcoholism. And I was delighted. It was a crushing blow, as Fred says in the book. It was like, yes, I've got my diagnosis. But on the other hand, it's like, fuck, I can never safely use drinking drugs again. Okay, so we moved on to step 2. Lack of power is my dilemma. If I've got no power, I needed to find myself a power, and it had to be greater than myself. What choice did I have but to be willing? I was dying. I was that close to the gates of insanity or death as described in the book. And I came to believe, and I made a decision in step 3, the biggest decision I've ever made in my life. And in treatment, they say, don't make any big decisions in your first year. Well, making that decision in step 3 was a pretty fucking big decision. And I'll tell you, it's worked no end. Yeah, not a resolution, but a decision. And since I've made that decision and I've turned my will over to the care of God, as I understand Him, remarkable things are happening, guys. I feel safe and protected today. It was a massive weight off my shoulder. My problem is that I can't manage my own life. Robbie's best thinking got him into the state that he was in. So I had to turn myself over to this power. I've got a new manager today. I am no longer in the management business. I'm in the action business, and I leave the results to God. And up to this point, he's been doing, I've been all right. I haven't picked up or used today. If you're new back from Marila, if the word God puts you off, right, don't worry. And it scares you out of these rooms. Alcohol and drugs are just going to scare you right back in here. That's my experience. The word God is used over 300 times in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, also known as Spirit of the Universe, realm of the spirit, creator, father, employer, director. Yeah, I've got a new one of those today, and it's absolutely wonderful. I'm not going to do a stepologue, guys. I don't have enough time to go through it. I just want to share that today I live in step, I'll talk a little bit about the amends process, because that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. A lot of people are put off by that. But today, having made amends and showing through my actions that I'm not the same person that I was, not saying sorry. I've never said sorry during an amends. I am remorseful, regretful. I am apologetic. I am not sorry, because that word coming out of my mouth means absolutely sweet fuck all. I've had a chance to show these people in my life over the last 3.5 years. I've got a permanent sobriety date of the 6th of June, 2022. You know, it makes me just over 3.5 years clean and sober today. You know, but by the grace of God, and um, you know, life is amazing. Like as a result of doing these amends, and God keeps presenting um, what's the word? You know, God keeps presenting people to me that I still need to make amends to, is what I'm trying to say, that I didn't cover off in my step 4 and my five. Because let's face it, I drank to blackout, and it's only when I see people that I remember the horrible things I might have done to them, and that keeps happening, and I keep having to continuously making amends and cleaning up the wreckage of the past that I left behind. You know, I was a tornado that was, you know, not was roaring through the lives of other people, you know, and I didn't even see it. I was so selfish and self-centered. But today I can see that, and I've got an opportunity. My parents last year gave me the keys to the garage so that I could water the tomatoes in the greenhouse. You know, this year I got the keys to the house so I could take their mail into the living room. That might not seem like much, but that's a fucking miracle for me. You know, I'm starting to earn the trust back from my parents. You know, I've got my daughter back in my life. She's got her dad today. You know, that is wonderful too. You know, today I live in the steps 10, 11, and 12. Okay. I see them like a three-legged stool. If I don't work any one of these 12 steps, then the leg's going to fall from under me and I'm going to fucking drink and use again. So I need to work these steps like my life depends on it. You know, continuing to take personal inventory and continuing to set right any mistakes. This must continue. You know, I've said the word continue. This is a lifelong process that I have to continue to work on. You know, when these things crop up in step 10, I love what's it, an anagram? WADAT. You know, I continue to watch, ask, discuss, make amends, and turn my thoughts. That's how I live my life today, through WADAT, step 10. And step 11, guys. Wow. You know, that's it for me. I've recently shaken up my meditation, and I'm doing a bit of two-way prayer, and what a difference it has been. You know, it's one thing praying and asking God, but it's another thing listening to him and him telling me what I need to do. You know, I love growing and understanding what his will is for me. You know, it's like the book says itself, our main purpose is to be of maximum service to those around us, you know. And I ask myself every night, how much time have I spent with God, and how much time have I spent with God's children? You know, it's my primary purpose today. Thank you, group, for allowing me to come and share, you know, my experience, strength, and hope. And hopefully, you know, I've reached out to just one person in this meeting tonight. You know, my work will have been done. I've fulfilled my 12-step commitment. You know, I'll continue to do that. You know, I have service is a massive part of my recovery today. You know, my home group is clear-cut directions on a Monday night, another solution-based meeting, you know, a hybrid meeting just like this one, which is fantastic. You know, it's great to see some people in the room, although I can't see it, and have some people on Zoom as well. You know, you're welcome to come and join us on a Monday night. You know, we started that meeting some 3.5 years ago. You know, that was my first encounter with Cocaine Anonymous. You know, to still be part of that meeting today is absolutely amazing, to watch it grow and see newcomers come in and be able to help them. And sponsorship, guys, you know, it is incredible to see the light coming back on in people's eyes, to give them a chance, you know, to take them through what and show them what was shown to me, and see them get their lives back. I think the book says it's the bright spot of our lives, and it really is. You know, in order to stay well, I need to keep doing this stuff, because for a sick guy like me, you know, I know that very, very quickly I'm going to get ill again. I've had a right shit couple of days, by the way. I crashed my car into a lamppost yesterday. I nearly took someone out on a dual carriageway because I didn't look over my shoulder before I pulled out to overtake somebody. You know, I see I see God in everything today, and these are just signs from him that I need to calm down a little bit and I need to just relax. I get really passionate about Cocaine Anonymous because I know this stuff works. Let me tell you, I'm as passionate today as I was when I first came in and discovered the solution that's on offer in here. You know, this is a wonderful, life-breathing, life-giving fellowship. So if you are new, you know, welcome from the bottom of my heart. You know, it all starts by asking for help. It's an ass-saving kit. Just ask someone for help. You know, we will help you. You know, we will take you through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous as we were shown. You know, and you can have a life. Yeah, you can get a new life. I don't know how long I've got left, brother. I forgot to start the timer before I started sharing. Dave, can you give me a heads up?
Good now. It's good now.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, listen, welcome everybody, and thank you, Dave, for calling me up and asking me to be of service. It really is a privilege and an honor to be part of Cocaine Anonymous and to be able to carry the message and this message. You know, the 12 steps is the message, and to let people know that you can recover from this illness. All right, thank you very much. God bless.